This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 200 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we're going to explore 10 ways you can give a better lecture. It would be an understatement to say that lecturing is frowned upon in modern teaching. At this point, it's almost become a cliche. Don't be the sage on the stage, be the guide on the side. Ideally, we should stick to supporting students through inquiry learning, cooperative learning, project-based learning, and so on. I have personally advocated for all of these approaches over and over again, and I do believe that students need to be active in their learning. But does that mean we dump lectures altogether? At a time when TED Talks and online courses are incredibly popular, when our students get at least some portion of their instruction through video-based blended learning platforms, and when most people listening to this have probably learned something useful or interesting in the last month from YouTube, aren't we all learning from lectures all the time? In this episode, I'm going to challenge the rule that says we should never lecture, talk about times when lecture might be the best choice, and offer 10 ways you can improve the lectures you do give. Before we get started, I'd like to thank EverFi for sponsoring this episode. Do you want to prepare your students for career and life success, but you're short on time? Busy teachers use EverFi's standards-aligned, ready-made digital lessons to teach students to thrive in an ever-changing world. Interactive, game-based lessons designed by experienced educators help you engage students at all grade levels and bring critical real-world skills like financial readiness, emotional literacy, STEM, and much more to your classroom. Thanks to EverFi's partners, all K-12 schools and students have access to EverFi's lessons free of charge. Join the 60,000-plus teachers who used EverFi's award-winning lessons this past school year to serve over 5.5 million students. With fall semester officially in full swing, now is the perfect time to give your students a jump start on their future. Go to cultofpedagogy.com/everfi, EVERFI, and sign up to get a virtual swag bag full of free goodies to get the school year off to a great start. Support also comes from Hapara, a suite of instructional management tools for K-12 that is like nothing else. Hapara is the only tool on the market that provides ethical monitoring features, allowing educators to give students timely formative feedback with a reason for closing a tab. What is ethical monitoring? It's a way to provide visibility into what your students are doing when they're learning online and to help them stay on track without constantly closing browser tabs or punishing them. Ethical monitoring leads to good digital citizenship in students, which is why you need a monitoring tool with features that allow you to foster positive relationships with learners, not adversarial ones. No other product in the edtech space has a feature that enables educators to give reasons for closing tabs. They simply close browser tabs for students, and in turn, close off the possibility for them to learn how to exercise their executive functioning skills and make good decisions online. Hapara helps educators build relationships with students while giving them autonomy over their education. Visit hapara.com/cultofpedagogy, HAPARA.com/cultofpedagogy to learn more about supporting digital citizenship skill building for students through ethical monitoring. So let's get into this conversation about lecturing. I would argue that two factors have given lectures a bad name: overuse and poor execution. Let's look at these issues one at a time. So this first segment we're calling Using Lectures with Intention. The first problem with lecture as a teaching strategy is overuse. If a course is built entirely on lecture, if every class meeting is a solid block of the teacher talking non-stop, students will dread going to class. But if lecture is just one of many different strategies we use to design learning experiences for students, students are more likely to look forward to those experiences. The key is choosing a lecture intentionally to meet certain learning goals. So what are those goals? What are good reasons to choose a lecture over some other method? In his post, In Defense of Lecture in the Classroom, high school psychology teacher Blake Harvard advocates for its simplicity and straightforwardness. Lecture imparts knowledge, he writes. Knowledge is a requirement for innovation and creativity. Simply put, you cannot be creative with knowledge you do not have. This is why, when initially presenting information to students, I try to do so in as simple a method as possible. Creating an environment with as few distractions as possible decreases the extraneous load on our limited working memory and allows for the possible processing of more material. When considering whether a lecture might be the right choice for a particular lesson, there's a resource from the University of Tennessee that offers some guidelines, and this is linked in the blog post that's associated with this podcast. If you just go to Cult of Pedagogy, go to the podcast section and click episode 200, you'll go to a very long blog post that has all the links to everything I talk about. So this particular resource advises that lecture is a good fit when the background information is not available or accessible to students, the content may be confusing and therefore need explanation, when the teacher's expertise will help make the material more clear, or when the material needs to be delivered quickly. I would think of it this way. If you have a chunk of material that students need to know in order to do something more higher order with it, would it make more sense to have them slowly discover that information on their own through some sort of inquiry project? Or is it more of a priority for them to learn that material pretty quickly so that they can apply it in a higher order task? There is no one right answer here. The best way to determine if a lecture is the best option is to test it out yourself with your students. Teach one chunk of your material in a lecture and another through some other method like a reading, a constructivist activity like concept attainment, or a project-based task. Then see which method resulted in the most enduring learning. Or if you teach several sections of the same class, use different methods in different sections and see what works best. So now let's get into the other factor that has made lectures taboo, which is poor execution. If an instructor does nothing but drone on and on in the style of Ben Stein in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, then students will disengage quickly and very little learning will happen. So along with using lectures more selectively, we need to make sure the lectures we do give are good. As I regularly do when looking for classroom practices that work, I went out in search of the best ideas on lecturing from classroom teachers on Twitter. The best suggestions that came in are summarized here. So the first way to improve a lecture is to give it structure. Even if a lecture isn't particularly exciting, it's important to make it easy to follow. Do this by giving your presentation a clear structure and communicating that structure to your students. A good place to start is by looking at the most common text structures for informational writing. Even though your final product isn't in print, you're still basically creating a text, so that is a kind of writing. So the text structures are compare, contrast, cause and effect, problem solution, definition or description, and sequence. The content you want to teach will probably fit nicely into one of these frameworks. And if you plan and deliver it that way, you'll be more likely to give a lecture that makes sense. Once you have the basic structure in place, preface it with a brief introduction where you preview the main points of the lecture to show where you're headed. And if you really want to polish it, add a creative anticipatory set to grab students' attention at the beginning. A brief anecdote, an interesting quote, a thought-provoking image or question, anything to grab students' attention and get them curious about the lesson. So that was number one, give it structure. Number two, keep it brief. Attention spans are short, so to keep your students engaged, don't talk for more than a few minutes at a time. This can be accomplished by only planning a short lecture to begin with. Recommendations range from 5 to 10 minutes, or by breaking up a longer lecture into shorter chunks with interactivity in between those chunks. Number three, engage your audience. In between those short stretches of teacher talk, you can do all kinds of things to get students participating. One way is through whole class polls, which can be done electronically with a tool like Poll Everywhere. You simply ask students a question related to the content, either a question to check their comprehension, an opinion question, or something that asks them to contribute an idea. and within seconds, the responses can be displayed on a classroom screen, offering a starting point for discussion. If you'd rather not mess with tech, you can just as easily ask for a show of hands in response to a question, or do something more active like a quick this or that activity, where students move to one side of the room or the other based on their answer to a question. Another way to add interactivity is with discussion, which can be plugged in between lecture segments. In pairs or small groups, students can respond to questions that ask them to reflect, brainstorm, or expand on what's being presented in the lecture. And finally, there are student engagement platforms like Nearpod and Pear Deck that allow you to add interactive elements into your slideshow and share them with students so they can respond to questions right inside the presentation, and then you can see their responses on your own screen. These breaks serve more than one purpose. Yes, they offer variety and keep students engaged, and they can also serve as assessment opportunities. As you listen to and observe how students respond to these prompts, you can gauge how well they're understanding the material and make adjustments to your instruction as needed. In addition to these activities in between lecture chunks, you can also keep students engaged during the lecture by having them take notes and encouraging them to doodle or draw while you talk. If you're skeptical about whether note-taking is worth it, episode 104 offers a thorough review of the research on note-taking, which, spoiler alert, it's very much worth the time. And in episode 111, we share a fantastic strategy for teaching students how to take notes. Number 4 is use visuals. Adding some kind of meaningful visuals to support your lecture will help students understand and remember what you teach. In fact, I would go so far as to say a lecture without any visual support, unless it's simply for inspiration like a TED Talk, will not be effective. People just learn better when words are combined with images. This is the theory of dual coding, and it's supported by decades of research. Your visuals can be any combination of charts, graphs, photos, or physical models. But we're not talking about decoration here. They have to contribute to student understanding of the material. Oftentimes, this can be accomplished with a simple graphic organizer to show the relationships between concepts. And in episode 81, I go into a ton of detail about the power of a good, simple graphic organizer. If the visuals you're using are complex, it may also make sense to let students watch you create them piece by piece, like on the board, rather than present their finished form on a slide. English teacher Andy Tharby, author of the book How to Explain Absolutely Anything to Absolutely Anyone, recommends using the board to build these kinds of visuals. He says, your notes, squiggles, arrows, and diagrams are an open, incremental narrative. They have been produced bit by bit, and so not only do they model your thinking processes, but they also allow students to look back at previous steps if they lose track, zone out for a moment or two, forget something, or cannot hold everything at once in their working memories. So building them piece by piece is great, but slides are a perfectly good way to add visuals to a presentation if you do them well. Episode 129, which is called Let's Make Better Slideshows, is dedicated entirely to specific principles you can follow to do just that. Number 5 is use examples. You can explain something till you're blue in the face, but until you provide an example of a concept, your students are much less likely to really get it. And more is better on this one, because as students are exposed to different examples of the same idea, their understanding gets more refined. When she helps PhD students prepare to present their research in lectures, Stanford lecturer Kelly McGonigal advises them to talk about crunchy details, not abstractions. She says, I don't want to know that you study the technological interface of emotions and artificial intelligence in market analysis of blah, like basically a string of nouns. Point to something that you actually study, like, for example, a dating app. And what problem are you trying to solve? How to get people better matches or something like that. Show me the actual thing. So keep looking for opportunities to add crunchy details to your own lecture. Number 6, use analogies. Along with examples, analogies can make an abstract idea come to life. Comparing some new thing they're learning to a thing they already know can often be the fastest way to help students understand something. And in the post, I linked to another article by Andy Tharby, who I mentioned earlier, who offers a big list of different kinds of analogies you can use to make sense of things. Here's just one example. He says, using the same sentence structure repetitively is the writing equivalent of munching on boiled cauliflower and nothing else for the rest of your life. So the more you can come up with analogies like this to make things clearer for your students, the more it's going to make sense for them. Number 7, tell stories. Many of the teachers who responded to my tweet cited storytelling as a key element of a good lecture. Public speaking experts like Carmine Gallo in his books Talk Like Ted and The Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs include storytelling as an essential tool of good speakers. The power of story is backed by research. Stories create new mental images and strong emotional responses in listeners, and they provide a familiar, non-threatening way to ease students into learning. Listening to stories activates parts of the brain that are unresponsive when taking in non-narrative content. And incorporating stories or storifying our content is a recommended approach for making our instruction more culturally responsive because it reflects the way many other cultures pass important information from generation to generation. So whenever you can include a captivating story as a way to teach some part of your content, do it. Number 8 is think out loud. As you give a lecture, it can be incredibly helpful if you verbalize your thinking process along the way. This is especially true if you're demonstrating some kind of process or skill, like solving a math problem or drafting a piece of writing. But it even works when you're explaining a set of facts. If you come to a place that is often confusing to students or that even confused you once upon a time, take the opportunity to share that confusion with students. It will not just clear up their misunderstanding, but it will also reassure them that feeling uncertain is a normal part of the learning process. Number 9 is make it dynamic. You'll hold students' attention better if you make a concerted effort to mix things up. To emphasize a point, pause, lower your voice dramatically, or go up sharply in volume. Add physical interest by moving to different parts of the room while you speak, using memorable gestures to accompany certain points, or just being more expressive with your face. Activate emotions by inserting humor, personal details, or weird or surprising facts. And plan these moments. Instead of just generally aiming for a more dynamic presentation, actually mark places in your lecture notes where you plan to include these elements. Number 10 is move it to the end. Lectures typically deliver what we call the direct instruction piece of a lesson, the part where we are directly teaching our students something. And in a traditional lesson, that direct instruction happens at the beginning. We teach our students something, then they do something to apply the knowledge they just got. If we move things around, giving our students an opportunity to wrestle with the content a little bit first, then providing some direct instruction through a lecture, we stimulate their curiosity, get them thinking about the material more deeply, and create a context in which to fit the information they're about to learn. Then, when we begin the lecture, students are much more invested in it. This was one of the 5 tips Norman Eng gave to college teachers for improving their instruction in our 2017 interview, which is episode 65. He recommends teachers start class with a discussion, a question, a challenge, or an activity that connects to the content, and then move into a lecture. Sometimes the wrestling students do can actually become the lecture. On the Twitter thread, math teacher Will Dunn described how he starts his classes by presenting a problem to the whole group, then has students work on their own similar problems in small groups. Rotating among the groups, Dunn finds noteworthy examples from student work and then uses those examples in a subsequent lecture. So again, as a review, we're going to go through these tips one more time. Number 1, give it structure. 2, keep it brief. 3, engage your audience. 4, use visuals. 5, use examples. 6, use analogies. 7, tell stories. 8, think out loud. 9, make it dynamic. and 10, move it to the end. So my final thought I am calling the right tool at the right time. There is a lot of value in a well-planned, well-executed lecture. Just be intentional about it. Don't spend whole class periods lecturing. Don't lecture every single day. Don't use the same gimmick over and over again so it feels stale. What's so lovely about this work is that it truly is a craft that can be honed over time. And part of becoming masters of our craft is knowing when to use the right tool at the right time. Instead of reducing our work to a set of absolutes, let's treat teaching like the art form it is. For links to all the resources mentioned in this episode, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 200. To get a bi-monthly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, courses, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.